Everybody. Welcome to our pre-Shabbat sermon. The portion is the portion of Tissa. The Shabbos is also called Shabbos Parshas Parah, as we read a particular portion concerning the red heifer. I want to thank the sponsors for Kiddush this Shabbos. We have Josh and Jordana Goodman are sponsoring. This is in honor of their 25th wedding anniversary. Mazel Tov, Josh and Jordana. It's also sponsored by Ron and Sandy Stackler. This is in honor of the yahrzeit of Ron's grandfather, Isaac Stackler Yitzchak ben Shmuel. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the yahrzeit of Helen Berger's father, Rachmiel ben Avram. His neshama should have an aliyah. He should go higher and higher in the heavenly worlds. I begin also with Birchat Kohanim. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe Lemar, Daber l'Arava banav Lemar, Kais yivarechu es b'nei Yisrael amar lahem. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Yoir Adonai pana v'elecha v'chuneka, Yis Adonai pana v'elecha, v'yasem lecha shalom, v'samuel shemi al b'nei Yisrael v'ani avorachem. We're also going to be having a lecture this Sunday by Dennis Prager. It's at 5 p.m. this Sunday. The subject is Jewish values. It's going to be aired on Facebook, on our Facebook page. You go to facebook.com/Jewish Academy. If you're not yet a friend, or if you haven't liked that page, please do so. This way you'll be notified anytime that we post something on our Jewish Academy page on Facebook. The same time, while you're on Facebook, if you are a Facebook member and you're not friends with me yet, shame on you. Just go ahead and click the friend thing so that the two of us can become friends. And this way I can keep you updated as well on any upcoming activity. So that you go to facebook.com, look up Moshe Bryski, and click the button that says that you want to be my friend, because I want to be your friend. Let's all be friends. This week's portion. The Torah is filled with many biblical stories. We've been spending our last few months, Monday evenings at 7:30. You're welcome to join us, focusing on the stories of the book of Genesis. But the Torah has many stories. The book of Exodus also has stories. It's important that we keep in mind that although the stories are real and the stories are true, the Torah is not a storybook. It's not even a history book. The Torah is a book of teachings. It's a book of laws. It's a book of guidance. It's a book of connection between the Almighty and man. It's a book for the chosen people to learn how to act chosen. And the Torah uses the medium of stories to bring these messages to our attention, or to teach us how to behave, or at times to teach us how not to behave. So we'll learn a great deal about character, about the character that we should strive for from the behavior of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'll learn a lot about family struggles and how to overcome them from the story of Joseph. We'll learn the might of God and the divine intervention of the Almighty from the stories of the Exodus. But of all the stories of the Bible, one of the most difficult ones to accept, one of the most difficult ones to understand, at least at first glance, is the story of the sin of the golden calf in this week's portion. And you will always come back to one simple question. How can it be that a nation that just witnessed all those miracles, the miracles in Egypt, the plagues that took place in Egypt, the splitting of the sea, the Exodus, the singing of the song that they sang after the splitting of the sea, a song of tremendous faith, of complete faith. Now, you can't read that song that the Jewish people sang in praise of God after the miracle of the splitting of the sea, and then read this chapter about the sin of the golden calf. Read them side by side and believe that these two took place a little over 2 months apart. It doesn't work. In here, they're singing a song of praise that they have this absolute faith in God and total trust in God. And now we understand everything. And 2 months later, they're worshiping a golden calf. And this is without yet even mentioning the 10 Commandments. They just experienced the revelation. direct revelation of God, divine communication, each and every one that was there. And in this communication, they were told not to worship idols, commandment number 2. The holiness and the intensity of the revelation was so overwhelming. The revelation was a once in history event. And we know that the Jewish people, they anticipated it. They knew once they left Egypt that this was going to happen, and they begin to count down the days. They count down the 7 weeks from Passover to Shavuot, to the giving of the Torah, to the revelation at Mount Sinai, with such excitement and such anticipation. How can it be that just 40 days after the revelation at Sinai, they're bowing to a golden calf? There's so much that needs to be understood. What were they thinking? Were they thinking God would just let them get away with it? How stupid could they be to believe that a golden calf could be a god? I would like to think that our ancestors were a little smarter than this. There are so many questions. In the short period that we have together here on Friday, we're not going to cover all of these questions. We've covered them in our study groups, in our Wednesday study group, and various different study groups. But I'd like to give you just a little bit of an insight as we go into this Shabbat, and a little bit of an understanding, perhaps from a different perspective, of this story. And those that will be coming to our outdoor services tomorrow, I will continue on this theme tomorrow of having to try to get a little bit of a better understanding. If you're interested in coming tomorrow, it's at 9:30 a.m. We daven in an outdoor mishkan, as we call it, in our outdoor sanctuary. Hopefully very soon, all of the COVID restrictions will be lifted, and when the world will be back to full health, and we'll be able to gather inside the synagogue. In Mirz Hashem, it should happen sooner than later. So I want to set the scene for you. The 10 Commandments were given. Moses now climbs the mountain. He tells all the people, all the Jewish people, that he's going to be back in 40 days. He has a 40-day study session with God. He climbs the mountain. He's brought into the heavenly world to be taught directly by God the laws of the Torah, so that he can now return to the people and teach it to the people. Remember, at Sinai, they just heard the revelation directly from God of the 10 Commandments. But the Torah is more than just the 10 Commandments. And this is what God is teaching Moses in this session above the mountain, for Moses to then descend the mountain and teach it to us, teach it to the rest of the Jewish people. During this initial 40-day period, he's taught all the laws that we've studied in the portion of Mishpatim, all the civil laws of the Jewish people. He discusses many other laws of the Torah. And so we have the 10 Commandments, which is known by all. And now we have part of the Torah known only by Moses to be taught to all of Israel. And that will make up both the written Torah and the oral Torah, that which God is teaching Moses. While Moses is gone, the children of Israel are anxiously awaiting his return. Remember, they know that 40 days from now, Moses will descend the mountain to come back to them. They know about 40 days because Moses told them, I'll be back in 40 days. The problem is they began the count when Moses left the camp. They counted that as day number 1. What Moses meant was he's going to spend 40 days in discussions in a study session with God. But that 40 days would begin when Moses reaches the top of the mountain. The day he started the journey didn't count as day 1 of the 40. So while Moses was set to return on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, they expected him on the 16th. They were off calculation by 1 day. And the Torah alludes to this by using the word boshesh. Boshesh means they were disappointed in expectations. They had an expectation of when Moses was coming back to them. And when that doesn't take place at their expected time, panic breaks out amongst the camp of the Jewish people. And so this expectation, as the Torah is saying, was difficult for them. This buildup of their frustration really didn't just start on day 39. It really began for them quite earlier. They began to get frustrated and filled with anxiety when they questioned whether Moses can possibly survive this ordeal. Was Moses ever coming back? Why do I say that? You see, the Jewish people received direct revelation. They heard directly from the voice of God the Ten Commandments. The Torah tells us that they could no longer hear the voice of God, that literally their body could not contain the spiritual energy that was coming into the world through it, and they were going to die from it. It was picture getting too close to the sun, and the rays are just too powerful for you. And so they told Moses, tell God to stop. Tell God we can't contain this. We can't receive this much. And so Moses says, fine, I'll ask God to stop. And that's when it's set up that Moses would now climb the mountain. Moses will hear everything directly from God, and Moses will bring it back down to them. But they started wondering, could a human being survive that long in heaven? He didn't take any food with him. Could he make it? Could he survive up there? And if not, what if Moses doesn't survive? We're sitting ducks here in the wilderness. Without Moses and without all the miracles that Moses had performed for us, getting us manna from heaven, getting us water from a rock, getting all of the protection that we needed to survive, we don't stand a chance. So by the time day 39 came, which they thought was day number 40, and no Moses, now the panic breaks out. And now they begin to believe he didn't make it. Rumors start flying. We're stuck here in the desert without a leader. We're lost. We're left all alone. Moses died. He's not coming back. Now, I want you to think for a moment just how amazing this is. And I'll tell you why I use that word amazing. A better term would be touching. It is so touching to hear the Jewish people speak this way. Why? Because this is the same nation that just weeks ago complained complained bitterly about Moses. Who asked you to take us out of Egypt? Why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us here to the wilderness? If you don't get us water very soon, they were threatening him, complaining about him. Moses literally turns to God and says, hey, if I don't get water for them, they're going to put me to death. So here you have a nation complaining against Moses, literally at the verge of rebelling against Moses. And suddenly the mere thought, the mere rumor that he was not coming back leads to total chaos. They were separated from Moses for 40 days, and they couldn't survive. And they couldn't make it. And they were panicking. Someone I see asked the question in the chat there, how did they live during the 40 days? Once the miracle happened about the manna coming down from heaven, it continued even when Moses was in heaven. And the water continued as well. But the thought of Moses not being back with them, that's what sets in the panic. Will these miracles continue? And if it doesn't continue, who do we complain to? Who do we go to? Who's going to help us? So suddenly the same individual that they complained against is the individual that they believe they could not survive without for another day. Which leads to the question in their mind, how are we going to survive when Moses passes away, if he passed away? How will we survive when the manna stops falling? How will we survive when the cloud of glory stops leading the way? It's the same question we've asked throughout history. Can the Jewish people survive without the Holy Temple? Can we survive without our prophets? These were questions in every generation. Think about it. When the Babylonians came into Jerusalem and destroyed the Holy Temple, the question on the table was, is there a Jewish people tomorrow? Do we survive? It is miraculous that we're still doing our thing. that we're still practicing and studying our Torah. And it attests to the truth and the wonder of Torah, and it attests to the greatness of the Jewish people. We're still here. We're still doing it. We're talking about the Torah today on a Friday. We're going to celebrate Shabbat this evening. We're going to celebrate Passover in 3 weeks. We're still doing it long after Moses passed away, long after Samuel the prophet passed away, long after King David passed away, long after the Babylonians and the Romans came in, long after Mordechai and Esther, long after the story of Hanukkah. We're still here. We're still doing it. But that first generation didn't know that yet. That first generation is panicking. Without Moses, we don't stand a chance. Now, another point to make. Although there will be forgiveness, and I urge all of you, read the portion from beginning to end throughout the Shabbat, because I'm only covering a little bit of it, and I'm sure you all have many questions, and I'm not going to be able to answer all of your questions. So although there will be forgiveness, the story has many parts to it. I would say Act 1 is the sin itself. Act 2 is God's initial response. Read it in the text. Act 3, the defense of Moses, Moses' defense of the Jewish people, and I would call it Moses' defense part 1, because he will come back with a part 2. Act 4 is that God acquiesces to Moses' plea. Fascinating paragraph. Act 5, Moses confronts the people. Moses comes down the mountain and he confronts the Jewish people for their sin. And I want to jump to Act 5 right now. It's important to point out that although there will be forgiveness, do not confuse forgiveness with compromise. The Torah is non-compromising. This is the law. You can protest it, you can violate it, you can stand on your head, but the law will remain. Just because there was this grave sin 40 days after Sinai doesn't mean we're going to drop the experiment. Doesn't mean we're going to change the rules. Doesn't mean we're going to accommodate the failure. The law remains. Whether this people will remain, that's what the portion is about. How do they survive with the fact that they committed such a grave sin? But the Torah is the key to all of creation. The Torah does not accommodate itself to the weakness of a generation. But every age and every generation and every one of us need to accommodate our lives to the Torah. The first generation will struggle. It will sin. It will rebel. But the Torah will stand strong in its demands, and slowly this nation will mold itself around to its principles, to its mitzvot, to its laws. Forgiveness means when you recognize that you have failed to live up to its principles, when you recognize that you have failed to live up to God's will, and you recognize that you need to make a move, to make a change. That is when this same non-compromising God allows for forgiveness, allows for repentance, allows for the rebuilding of the relationship. He doesn't say, oh, okay, I see idol worship is too difficult for you, so you know what, let's forget about that one. Let's put that one away. It's okay. God is non-compromising. If God says in the Torah, idol worship is not acceptable, it's not going to be acceptable, not to that generation, not to a generation 1,000 years from them, not to our generation. Torah remains Torah. The fact that we're not doing every part of it, we have to learn, we have to study, we have to inspire ourselves, and we have to inspire others. We have to strive, we have to keep climbing up the mountain. Eventually we will get there. God will be very forgiving of the efforts, of the failures. That doesn't mean compromising. This is what the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was all about, of connecting ourselves to God, of finding a way to connect ourselves and reconnect ourselves after the great sin. And that's what prayer does for us today. It connects us. Now, although we often refer to the episode of the golden calf as idol worship, if you really look closely at the text, it doesn't appear to start out as such. It eventually becomes that. It led to idol worship. But really, if you read the verses closely, they seem to want a replacement for Moses, not for God. They say, Asher yelchu lefanenu. Remember, they think Moses died. Their fear is we're stranded. We need someone or something to lead us. Ki zeh ha'ish Moshe, they say, because Moses is not here. If they wanted a new God, what would have anything to do with Moses' presence or not? It's because Moses is not here that we feel threatened. So they go to Aaron and they want Aaron to give us a new Moses. But this time they use the word asay, make, not select, not choose, make, not a human. And that's why they don't ask Aaron himself to take over as the next leader. Because Aaron, you're also a human. You're also going to die. But what if we had a permanent representation of a leader, not a human being, something we could make? Now, we're never going to have this crisis again. If we can create something that will lead us, then that won't die. Now, before you dismiss this as idiotic, the idea of making a leader out of gold, you need to think about their culture. You need to think from where they're coming. Yes, they have a belief there is a God above all. They heard from him just a few weeks earlier. But us humans can't bear to hear his words. It's all too powerful. So let God channel his holiness and rest his presence in a physical entity, but not a human being. And then we'll receive guidance from it. Now, clearly the Torah doesn't allow for it, but is that so far-fetched? In defense of the Jewish people, let me say this. In the temple, in the Holy Temple, there was a special room. It was called the Holy of the Holies. In the Holy of Holies, there was an ark, right? It's the ark that Steven Spielberg made famous in his film Raiders of the Lost Ark. But it was actually famous way before Steven Spielberg. On the ark, there was a cover. And on top of the cover, there was something called the cheruvim. The cheruvim were these golden winged angels with baby faces facing one another. And it was from in between these two cheruvim that God's voice would emanate when he would want to communicate with Moses. Moses would stand outside the Mishkan and he would hear God talking to him from within the Holy of Holies. This very concept of God resting in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and later in the Holy Temple, it was physical. It was a physical, constructed temple. And God, it said, rested there. Part of the garments of the high priest was the breastplate. On the breastplate, there were 12 precious stones, and the stones were engraved the names of each of the tribes of Israel. When there would be a question that no one in the generation knew the answer to, they would go to the high priest. They weren't asking the high priest the question. He didn't know the answer. They would ask it of the Choshen Mishpat, of the breastplate. And the letters of the answers would illuminate on the letters that were engraved on the stones. So that God can choose to utilize a physical object in order to communicate is not as far-fetched as you may have thought. What was Moses' staff all about, right? Moses used his staff to perform miracle after miracle. What was the staff? So according to this understanding, at first, again, I say at first because later the mob gets hold of this and the mob turns it into pure idol worship. But at first, the initial thought was they were panicking because Moses wasn't there. And they wanted, you know what, let's not have a human leader. Let's have a human leader that doesn't die. So they were looking for a miraculous physical representation that would lead them. And as I said, this doesn't mean that no sin was involved. They were already taught at Mount Sinai that they can't do this. They were told at Mount Sinai, no graven images, not any man, not any beast that could be worshipped in any type of way. See, idol worshiping in Judaism doesn't mean that you no longer believe in God and choose a different God to worship. Idol worship in Judaism is even if you still believe in God, as these people certainly did because they just heard directly from it, but you want to add partners to God, extensions, trinities, golden calves. Judaism, unlike many religions, say no. This is what the second commandment and the brief few verses after the 10 commandments are all about. The 10 commandments came to teach us that not only was the individual who rejected God and chose an idol of any sort as his God an idol worshiper, but for the Jew, so was any worship of any deity where man invents the holiness. Those are the key words. You, human being, cannot create holiness. That's the violation of the second commandment. What God is saying to us more than anything is that we don't need it. We don't need a golden calf to connect to him. And therefore, if we still go for it, we're limiting our own relationship directly with God and substituting it for a physical item. If the Torah tells us to build an ark, then it's godly. If the Torah tells us to build a mishkan, then it's godly. If the Torah tells us to build a holy temple, then it's godly. And this is why, by the way, post-temple, when the temple was destroyed, we still have a relationship with God. We still have direct avenues that connect us to God every single day, every single moment. For we understand that the temple was not independent of God. The temple was part of God's will. And only because it was part of God's will did it have holiness to it. Without that, it was just gold. It was just silver. It was just stone. And in fact, when the temple was corrupt, it had no value. It had no holiness. The very same vessels was meaningless if it didn't lead to a direct relationship with God. But if God instructs it, then we can take a piece of hide. You can take a piece of hide of an animal, and you can write a mezuzah on it, and suddenly that which roamed the fields yesterday and made noises like meh can now be elevated to the status of holiness. That which was a part of an animal yesterday can today be holy, and you will make a blessing on it. Turn it into a mezuzah, turn it into a Torah scroll, turn it into a tefillin. They erred. Our ancestors erred. They wanted something that they could create on their own and establish it as their leader, as their conduit to God, as a conduit for holiness. That was their mistake. The message of the episode of the golden calf is that holiness comes from the Torah. You want to connect to holiness? Don't invent it on your own. Don't try to reinvent it. Don't try to remake it in your own image. Remember the old Coca-Cola commercials? It's the real thing. Stick with the Torah. It's the real thing. I know many of you had questions. You were posting questions. Best thing with the questions, email me, drop me an email, rabbi@chabadconejo.com. I'll try to get to them over the next few days. The Golden Calf has many, many questions, lots of questions. When we studied it in our Lunch and Learn class on Wednesday, I believe it took us 2 years to go through the entire story of the Golden Calf with all of the commentaries on it. So I just try to give you a little bit of a summary, a little bit of a message going into Shabbat. I urge you, take the Chumash out over Shabbat, study the entire story, email me some questions. I'll try getting back to you. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Have a wonderful Shabbos. I look forward to having you Monday evening, 7:30. We're studying biblical reflections, looking into the stories of the book of Genesis. Take care, everyone.